if you follow the geopolitical change, now at this moment, not only everyone is very concerned and regarding the fate of the United States of America. Again, given the fact that 2024, it's rather crucial. In this year, this nation is going to elect a brand new president. But meanwhile, when we look at the presidency of America, one thing that comes to our mind, which is the foreign policy. How much do we believe that the world today is getting more complicated? Not only we continue to see this competition between China and the US, and also we're seeing the war in Ukraine, and after that recently Vladimir Putin continued his presidency, and China, the Chinese leader recently quickly wrapped up his trip to some of the major players in the world. Putting everything together, some experts believe that we're living, rather the word is called, multipolarized the world. Are we seeing any solutions at this moment? And how should we understand the reaction from China and also the collaboration between China and Russia? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is an American historian and a political scientist. He is a professor of political science at Rutgers University in New York, and he is a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. Well, Dr. Motyl, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you so much, and thanks to your audience for listening.
Well, Dr. Motyl, again, as we mentioned before, some experts believe that today we're living in this what we called multipolarized world. Now, I want to read a quick statement and came out of by the current leader of Hungary. And again, as Chinese President Xi Jin Ping recently visited the country, and this is what he said, and I quote, that our voice, the voice of Hungary, it's a lonely voice in Europe. Europe today, it's on the side of war, with the only exception being Hungary, which is calling for immediate ceasefire and peace negotiation and supporting all international effort towards peace, including the Chinese peace initiated by Chinese President Xi Jin Ping. End quote. Professor, you're the expert. Help us with better understanding. Again, we're looking at the role that China plays today, and we're looking at this unlimited friendship between China and Russia, and also this positive atmosphere between China and Hungary. The question I would like to ask is, are we seeing the world become more multipolarized because of the presence of China and Russia? What do you say to that?
Well, the answer is yes, but after World War II, and roughly say until about, let's just pick arbitrarily a date like 2000, it was clear that the United States was completely dominant in every respect. Mind you, during the Cold War, the American power was balanced by Soviet power. America was stronger economically, it was probably stronger militarily, but there was a balance between the two. After 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States was clearly and evidently the only truly great superpower in the world. That's begun to change and has already changed, but only up to a certain degree. Because, of course, China has not quite yet completely caught up, but it's catching up. Its economy is huge. Per capita, the United States is better off, but that's simply due to the size of the population. China has a huge army, has a huge population and landmass. So in terms of a variety of very objective power indicators, China is catching up with the United States. Some people might say has caught up with the United States. But in any case, there's something like a balance between the United States and China, more or less. And it's certainly going in that direction. A multipolar world would be one in which you have more than three or more or less equally balanced states. We don't have that at the moment. Russia aspired to be the third part of this triangle. But as the war in Ukraine has shown, Russia's army is, let's just be kind and say it's mediocre. Its economy is weak. It's losing population, both to lack of natural processes and as a result of out-migration by highly skilled professionals. So Russia, which was hoping to be the third element in this new configuration, has suffered a major setback as a result of the war with Ukraine. No other country comes close. India has certain pretenses. Brazil, Nigeria, the countries that are in the BRICS process, but they're still very, very far away from the United States and China. So I'd say, assuming things continue at the present rate, yes, India will probably become more of a great power. How much more? Will it be able to outstrip China? I don't think so. Certainly not for a substantial period of time. Of course, everything could change. The Chinese economy isn't growing well. There might be instability in China. There already is instability in Russia. There's arguably some instability in the United States. So it's conceivable that, this dynamic may change in the next few years, possibly in the next few decades. But for the time being, I'd say that we are back in a bipolar world. Not multipolar, but bipolar. That, by the way, is good. Because as much as people argue, as much as people dislike bipolar worlds, because essentially that means that the world is divided between the United States and China, just as it was divided between the United States and the Soviet Union, the advantage of bipolarity is that it's relatively stable. The chance, as you know, the United States and the Soviet Union were never involved directly in a war. Thus far, the same is true of the United States and China. That doesn't mean that other wars aren't taking place, but the two big powers are sufficiently balanced to make war not impossible, but unlikely. And the problem with multipolarity is that even though it seems very just, reflective of realities, everybody has a voice, and so on, but at the end of the day, multipolarity is an invitation to conflict, because it's very easy for 2 or 3 countries to gang up on the fourth, and then you have trouble.
Dr. Motyl, I want to continue our conversation that during the recent visit by Vladimir Putin and to Beijing, this is the statement that Putin put out, and I quote, "The partnership between China and Russia is not directed against anyone. It is aimed at one thing, creating better conditions for the development of our countries and improving the well-being of the people of China and the Russia Federation." Now, Dr. Motyl, go back to your expertise. On one thing that we could believe, what Putin just said could be just for the political soundbite or this political PR. But on the other hand, is it possible for us to interpret that this is a commitment, or even this is what the word you said before, it's an invitation that from Russia Federation to China to say, we are all in this together. And by joint effort, we could improve the country's well-being of the people and also the better conditions. I'd assume that it could relate it to political condition, and also that could interpret it as economic condition. How much do we believe this is a solid pledge, or this is 100% guarantee from Putin to China? It's more, again, going back to the word, a commitment. What do you say to that?
I'd say it's more of a wish on Putin's part, because if you look at the economic relationship between China and Russia, it's extremely one-sided. Russia is importing a large number of Chinese goods. The car market, for instance, is almost exclusively dominated by the Chinese. The Chinese are importing oil and gas at significantly reduced prices, which is another way of saying that Russia is actually losing money by selling its energy products to China. So at the end of the day, the primary beneficiary of this particular relationship is China. It's not so much Russia, it's really China. And to some degree, it's an even disadvantageous relationship for the Russians. But the Russians, you see, have no alternative. Because of the war, they've alienated their major trading partner, which was always the European Union and the United States, but especially the Europeans. So they're losing that. They need to turn someplace else. North Korea is obviously too small, too insignificant. Iran has its other problems. So the logical place to turn is China, which for its own reasons has problems with the United States and the Europeans. So what we see here really is much more of a, let's call it a marriage of convenience. Putin wants to make it sound as if this is based on profound and deep love and respect. I doubt that that's the case. The Chinese have made it very clear that they will not be supplying weapons to Russia. They do supply Russia with dual-use technological elements. So they are helping the Russian war effort, but Russia would, of course, want to get more than that. So far, the Chinese, and remember, it's 2.5 years, have resisted that temptation. One has to keep in mind that both countries are not, as arguably are all countries, but certainly Russia and the Chinese are not motivated by charitable motives. They're concerned with their own self-interest. They're concerned with a very narrow understanding of self-interest. First and foremost, that means that the ruling elites stay in power. They're less concerned about the welfare of the populations. That's true certainly in the Russian case, but it's also true in the Chinese case. They're concerned with maintaining their ability to project military power to a greater or lesser extent. And in that sense, this particular relationship has evolved out of the fact that Russia and Ukraine are involved in a war. Russia has alienated its major political and economic partners, and it has no alternative but to go to China. Why else is Russia selling its oil and gas at reduced rates? Because no one else is buying the stuff. So it's better to sell it to the Chinese. There was even talk, for instance, as you probably know, there was talk of the Russians wanted the Chinese to build a pipeline that would extend from Russia to China, to which the Chinese have said, sure, go ahead, which is another, and that of course would be a losing proposition. It wouldn't result in any profit for the Russians. They'd simply be promoting the bargain rates that they're currently charging for their oil and gas. So the Chinese are concerned with their own interests. The Russians are concerned with their own interests. And as much as they may say that they are now fully, that they're fully in love with each other, that this is a marriage based on love and respect, the reality is it's very much a result of the circumstances under which both countries currently find themselves in. Remember, just looking historically, the Chinese have a variety of complaints to make to the Russians about Russian land grabs in the 19th century. There was the armed conflict in the Ussuri River in late 1960s. As you probably know as well, the Chinese have developed maps of Siberia and the Far East, and the major cities in these areas are no longer Russian. They've been given Chinese names. Now, that may simply be accidental, but it may also be reflective of certain territorial ambitions that China has. There are some analysts, Russian analysts, who say, again, I don't know how reliable this information is, that Putin has actually signed a deal with Xi, whereby Russia would be willing to lease territory in the Far East that would be as large as Ukraine to China for 49 years. That's essentially the equivalent of giving the territory away. Now, again, I don't know if that's true. It's probably reliable, but again, as I said, one has to take it with a grain of salt. But the overall picture is not one of an equal partnership. It's one of a vassal. And it's so typical. Putin goes to China with his entire government. There were reports that many of the ministers were treated with a certain degree of disrespect by some Chinese officials, which wouldn't surprise me. But he goes there as the supplicant. He goes to China in order to get something for his country. And the Chinese then respond by saying, well, maybe yes, maybe no. And it's clear who's in charge. It's Xi Jinping. It's not Vladimir Putin. It's Xi Jinping and it's China. They are setting the tune. They are completely in charge.
Well, Dr. Motyl, what about this no-limit relationship between China and Russia signed back in 2022? I mean, again, this was such a milestone for the countries, especially we're looking at the reaction from the U.S. military alliance in Asia and also the Pacific. I mean, again, there's no doubt that the beginning of the year that Xi Jinping reshaped the Chinese military structure, and correct me if I'm wrong, that if I'm not mistaken, that this year the Chinese military spending increased by 3.9% according to the latest research. So what does that say about this military joint effort between Russia and China under this condition or under this agreement? Again, even though maybe the word agreement, it's exaggerated, but still it's called no limits relationship. What does that say about the military power at this moment? I mean, again, we're still seeing the war in Ukraine, and we're still seeing the struggle of the Ukrainians at the front line at this moment. So what do you say to that?
Well, let's just start with the no limits phrase. That was not repeated at this particular meeting. That was a phrase that was used back in 2022, before the war began. And at that point, obviously, China and Russia, especially China, was willing to embark on, well, anything possible. And it's significant that now that there's a war going on, this business of no limits has not been repeated. Which isn't to say that there are limits, but that there probably are limits. And I suspect that's the way the Chinese see it. They don't want the Russians to lose badly, but they don't necessarily want the Russians to win. From their point of view, the ideal outcome would be an intact Russia that is weaker, and that is weaker militarily, weaker economically, and is even more dependent on China. The last thing China wants, and again, this is just simple geopolitics, is a Russia that is as strong as China. It's hard for me to imagine that those two countries would be able to get along in the manner of the last few years if they were at parity in terms of economy, in terms of military and things like that. There's just there's simply too many points of conflict for the relationship to be purely pacific, purely peaceful. And what China also doesn't want, or at least is fearful of, is this tendency by Putin, and it's manifest in the war in Ukraine, to engage in irresponsible use of his armed forces. What's significant about China for the last 50 or so years is that Chinese leadership, and there have been many Chinese leaders over the last 40, 50 years, they've all agreed on one thing: to avoid military conflicts. Instead, Chinese strategy has focused on economic issues. They've expanded their influence by means of investments, by means of, well, for instance, the Silk Road Initiative, the transportation links that they're building, the investments that they've made throughout the world, including South America, Africa, and other places. And what's striking is that all of this is being done peacefully and with respect for international norms. That doesn't mean to say that the Chinese leadership are now Jeffersonian Democrats. The point is, they know that this has been a very advantageous system and a set of rules and regulations that have benefited enormously China's economy and China's population. And along comes Putin, who's essentially a loose cannon, who starts a war stupidly, idiotically, that at this point he can't win. I'm not sure he'll lose, but he certainly can't win the war. And from the Chinese point of view, what he's doing is destabilizing the international system. He's thrown a wrench into these international norms. He's thrown a wrench into China's relationship with the European Union and the United States. That's not to say that China will go to war, anything but. But the point is that the Chinese see that the Russians are destabilizing a system, an economic system, a political system, an international norm system that has been enormously beneficial to China. So what do you do with the Russians? Well, you support them because having them on your side can make some difference. But at the same time, you don't want them to be too strong. You want them to be a weak partner. You want them to be a vassal, precisely of the kind that Putin has, in fact, become over the last 2 years.
Well, Dr. Motyl, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Let's talk about NATO and let's talk about the role of France. Again, in addition to his visitation to Hungary, Chinese President Xi Jinping also made a quick stop and encountered the French President Emmanuel Macron. And of course, that Macron was criticized heavily because his attitude or his ambition to build this relationship with China. So at this moment, why do you think it's so important for someone like Macron to continue to build relationship with China? Is it really for personal or diplomatic relationship, or actually trying to be a good guy when we're looking at majority of the countries in NATO are not actually in favor of China, and of course, definitely not on the side of Russia? I want to hear your final thoughts.
Well, again, from his point of view, but also from the point of view of the Americans, the British, and other major countries, and certainly the Germans, it's to their country's benefit to have good relations with China for a variety of reasons. For one thing, China is an economic superpower, and so much of the consumer goods that are imported into Europe and especially the United States come from China. Many computer parts, pharmaceuticals. As you know, the trade relationship is extremely important. There are complaints that the Chinese aren't playing by the rules, sure, But the bottom line is that the United States is as dependent on China, or let me put it this way, the West is as dependent on China as China is dependent on the West. So to have good relations, or maximally good relations, given current circumstances and tensions, is obviously in everyone's interest. There's also a second consideration, namely, there is, as you said, this so-called no limits partnership between Russia and China, and the Western countries are sufficiently historically attuned to know that if they could loosen that relationship, it would be to their benefit. So, for instance, if they could woo China somewhat further away from the Russians, or at least prevent China and Russia from, merging their interests even more, that would be to the benefit of the West. It would probably be to China's benefit, but it would certainly not be to Russia's benefit. And at this point in time, given the war in Ukraine, dealing with Russia, which isn't just, again, it's not just a question of geopolitical and economic interests. It's a question ultimately of survival, not just for Ukraine, but for the Europeans. Ultimately, it's a question of their own ability to survive as nations, as states. So to be able to pry Russia, or rather to pry China away from Russia, would make a great deal of sense. As you know, that's precisely what the United States pursued in the late 60s, early 70s, the policy of forming a closer relationship with then communist China, and not exactly forming an alliance between the United States and China against the Soviet Union, but the United States succeeded in weakening that particular relationship. Now, whether that will go this far today is a big question. No one really knows. But it makes a lot of sense. And then, of course, from Macron's personal point of view, having Xi Jinping visit him is a feather in his cap. It makes him look like a world leader. Remember that Macron has also been saying recently that if necessary, French troops might be sent to Ukraine if invited and if necessary. He was criticized for that by some, he was praised by others. But when Xi Jinping goes to Paris and visits and speaks to Macron, who said just that, in a way, that's a form of approbation. It's not. I don't mean to suggest that Xi Jinping wants French troops in Ukraine. But it is a way of acknowledging the fact that Macron may have a point, that it is a reality that needs to be considered. Not just diplomats have been meeting with a variety of Chinese diplomats. They've been trying to ease tensions. But as you know as well, the tensions are not of a military nature. They're exclusively, or almost exclusively, economic, to some degree political, but they're not military. So the prospects of China and the United States, or China and Europe, having a military conflict, again, if we keep Taiwan out of the equation, are very, very small. But there's reason to hope that Taiwan will not become a flashpoint. Of course, if it does, that changes the equation considerably.
Well, of course, again, as we're looking at this geopolitical change, and as we continue to focus on the war in Ukraine, people in Taiwan are very concerned about the results and also regarding the next step that China is going to take. But meanwhile, that again, the international community should closely continue to pay attention to the next political move and also this military move to China and Russia. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Dr. Alexander Motyl. Again, Dr. Motyl is an American historian, a political scientist, and he's a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. Well, Dr. Motyl, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention to this geopolitical change around the world. So thank you so much again for doing this.
Thank you, Will. It was a pleasure as always, and I hope to see you soon.